So, like I said, I'm taking you guys back to, I believe it is the 19th century. I don't know, I could be wrong on that. Anyway, still focusing on the early origins of boxing. I want you guys to know every bit of it. So, I'm sorry, somebody just sent me a text and it came through. So, boxing originated when the first person lifted a fist, I guess playing against another person. There are different eras of the sport between there's been different eras of the sport, and they have been distinguished by the use or no use of the fist coverings. The ancient Greeks believed that fighting was one of the games that the gods played on Olympus. Thus, it became part of the Olympic Games, and in about 688 BC, Homer has a reference to boxing in the Iliad. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. During Roman times, the sport began to thrive on a wide scale. Boxers fought with leather bands wrapped around their hands. Sometimes they would have metal in them, and they were called a cesti, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which would result in a bloody duel, and sometimes to the death. Boxing diminished after the fall of Rome. It was revived in the 18th century in England, so I was wrong on how far back I was taking you. It's even further. And became especially popular during the championship reign of James Figg, who held the very first heavyweight title from 1719 to 1730. Boxing became a working man's sport during the Industrial Revolution. I know boxing was kind of looked at as like the manly man sport there for a long time. It became a working man's sport during the Industrial Revolution as prize fights. It attracted participants and spectators from the working class, which I think's changed a little bit more because you have to be a little bit higher than working class to be able to afford boxing tickets most of the time. It just depends on where you go, unless you go to like an amateur show. Organization was minimal at first, and the bouts of these eras resembled street fights more than modern boxing. At the time, I guess they really hadn't learned what people call the sweet science of boxing. They hadn't got all that down yet. They were just kind of figuring it out and looking at it as a manly man sport. The second heavyweight champion was Jack Broughton, I'm assuming, which he was from England. He drew his own set of rules for his bouts. And these were recognized in 1743. Now, they outlawed some of the more gory aspects of the sport that had acquired, such as hitting below the belt line. Instead of a ring, which back then it was just kind of people standing around, and they would sit around in a circle and they would box in them. Jack Broughton brought up the idea of a ring, hence, or a box. Boxing, box, get it, ha ha ha. Anyway, but it was still always called a ring. So he wanted the squared off area, and that's where the ring came from, and that's where it originated from, was from this guy and his set of rules. His rules governed what is known as the bare knuckle era. Now, if you look back on bare knuckle boxing, it has a really vast history in certain cultures, I want to say. I don't want to name off a bunch. I don't want to name off a lot of them because there's going to be some people that just don't disagree, and then some people don't even know about some of these cultures that do exist. But yeah, it was always ruled as like the manly man sport. I even remember reading at some point that when they started adding more rules, people felt like it took away from the manliness of the sport because, you know, boxing 3-minute rounds with a minute rest for 10 to 15 rounds isn't manly enough. They want blood. They want gore, and they want to see him fight to the death. Now, while I could see how that would be interesting. Murder is illegal. And I don't think there's any way to legalize murder. I mean, accidents happen. If you accidentally kill somebody, that's different. It happens all the time in boxing and wrestling. Well, not all the time, but, you know, it's happened. It's been crazy for me looking back at, like, the first bits, like, the first little tidbits of history. Like, I knew a lot about boxing, but I didn't know all these little small details of boxing, just how far back it went. You know, that it started off with no rule sets like UFC. You know, it of course wasn't mandated very early. I don't know when the association came along that does all that. The athletic commission. I don't know. I have to look. We don't have an athletic commission here in Tennessee, which is where I'm at. Even like doing wrestling, if I were to go to Kentucky, I would have to apply for a license. Everybody has to. Ref, managers, wrestlers, and yes, I'm talking about like professional wrestling, like WWE. In Tennessee, you don't, but you do have to carry insurance. And what your insurance is for is it doesn't cover your workers, it covers the crowd. So you don't, you know, if you get sued because somebody accidentally gets hurt, you're covered. And that's law. So it's crazy. They've been talking about putting in an athletic commission here. Now, I know that we used to have a lot of Golden Glove spots here. I don't know if we still do. And I'm curious on how they were really kind of mandated. Since I don't know if we have an athletic commission here for that. I know when we do wrestling, it's through AAU. I'm talking about like real wrestling, you know, collegiate style wrestling, freestyle wrestling, Roman Greco. It's all AAU. So we have to apply for your membership, and then we have to abide by their rules. But, you know, we also travel a lot with that kind of wrestling. And it's mostly kids. So, yeah, learning this stuff's been a lot of fun for me. I've read some stupid comments that women aren't real fans of sports like this because it isn't, you know, bred into us or in our DNA. It's total bullshit and total lie. I've been a huge fan since I was a kid. It's the whole reason why I got involved before. I never had an amateur boxing fight, but I had amateur kickboxing fights and stuff like that. But as far as just having a straight up boxing fight, I didn't. Back then there was 3 women in the local Golden Gloves, and at that point in time the first woman had ever won a belt in Golden Gloves history, and she won it against a man, and it was here where I live, and the woman was actually a school teacher. Pretty interesting stuff. If you get to looking, you'll probably find out about it, because I know it made the news everywhere. Because back then we didn't have any women, so if we wanted to spar, we sparred with the guys. If we wanted to fight, we fought with the guys. That isn't why I never went into fighting. I think a lot of it was because I was still underage, and if I had to, you know, if I wanted to compete, there was a chance that I would be competing with somebody of age, and that can make somebody feel uncomfortable, and I totally get that. I've been talking about maybe revisiting that part of my life and doing it again if I can get my health straightened out. But I hope you guys stick with us. This should get a lot more fun and a lot more interesting as we get more and more and more into the history. Because once I'm done with that, then we're going to start the fun stuff of looking at the fighters. So, I hope you stick around. Like us. Give us a thumbs up so everybody else can see us. Turn on the little notification bell. You know, help us grow this channel because it's really going to be a lot of fun. I promise. Love you guys.